Hey Apush students, back again with another video. Today I want to talk to you about the upcoming AP exam and the DBQ, which is going to make up the exam this year. As I mentioned to you in the last video, it's going to be an abridged DBQ with only 5 documents instead of the regular 7 documents. And there's a couple of other changes on the DBQ that I just wanted to go over with you and just highlight those for you. So the first thing I want to just cover is some of the similarities that exist between the traditional DBQ format and this year's modified DBQ format. So the thesis or the claim section of the test of the essay will not change for this year. So that's still defined as responding to the prompt with a historically defensible thesis or claim that establishes a line of reasoning. So as we've discussed in the past, the best place to place this would of course be at the end of the first paragraph, and it would be helpful, as we've discussed, to use the although or while formulation, because that will indicate that you have a little bit of more of a complex understanding of the topic. So again, this is no different from any thesis statement that you've written before. And it should come at the end of the first paragraph. Another similarity, which will not change for this year's exam, will be the contextualization point. So in order to earn that point, you have to discuss the context, the historical background, the historical circumstances that led up to the topic being discussed in the question. And I would encourage you to do this in a separate paragraph, which would come after your introductory paragraph. So as we've discussed, you can include contextualization in your introductory paragraph, but to kind of highlight what you're doing in this section, you really want to try to just separate it out and have a standalone paragraph, which is basically background information, right? How do we get to this point that's being discussed in the question at hand? And it says specifically, to earn the point, the response must relate to the topic of the prompt. And you have to connect it to broader historical events, developments, or processes that occur before, during, or continue after the time frame of the question. This point is not awarded for merely a phrase or a reference. So again, it shouldn't just be a throwaway sentence or two. You should try to elaborate, how do we get to this point in time that's being discussed in the DBQ. So again, that's no different than the contextualization point that we have discussed already. So on to some differences now. The major difference between this year's DBQ and the traditional DBQ is that there will only be 5 documents as opposed to the traditional 7, and you have to use, quote unquote, 4 out of the 5 documents in your essay. And by use, they mean not just to mention the document, but you have to, first of all, accurately explain the document, and then you also have to connect the document to the thesis. You have to explain, how does this information that's in the document either support or contradict what it is that you're trying to argue. And then the third thing that you have to do, again, with 4 out of the 5 documents, is you have to explain something about the point of view of the document. Does this person have a first-hand knowledge of the topic at hand? Do they have a particular role in the topic at hand? And it's not just sufficient, as many of you often do, to just say this person may be biased or that they are biased. That's kind of inherently assumed about all sources, is that they contain some bias. But you have to explain what specifically that bias is and how does it affect their message, the information that you are conveying here. So it's not just enough to say this person is biased, as many of you do in your essays, but you have to point out what position this person has, how that position relates to the topic at hand, and how that might affect the information that they are providing in the document. So that's for the document. So again, 4 out of 5 have to be used. They have to be accurately explained. They have to be connected. You have to make an explicit connection between the information in the document and your thesis. and then you have to go on to discuss the point of view or some type of background information about the source. Another difference in this year's is the so-called outside information, or as they put it, evidence beyond the documents. So in the traditional rubric, you only have to have one piece of so-called outside information, which is different from the information discussed in your context paragraph. So it has to be something new, but obviously related to the topic in the question. So in this year's test, you can use two, and so there are two potential points here for quote-unquote outside information. And as the rubric says, to earn this point, your response must describe the evidence and must use more than a phrase or a reference. So again, you have to elaborate, you have to discuss, again, what is this outside information, this group, this piece of legislation, this organization, this political leader, but also how does it relate to the topic, right? So it's not just enough to mention them, you have to make and establish an explicit connection between that information and the topic at hand. And again, it has to be different from the information that was contained in the background or contextualization paragraph. So again, there are two distinct pieces of outside information here that you can use for two distinct separate points. The final portion, which again has some similarities but also some differences, has to do with the so-called analysis and reasoning. And there are up to 3 potential points that can be earned here. So to get 1 point, you have to simply discuss, as we mentioned in analyzing the documents, just one document, its purpose, its point of view, historical situation, its audience, and explain its relevance to the argument. But you should also do that for a second document as well. So you're using 4 documents, but you're really analyzing point of view, historical background, audience for 2 of the 4. And it's my suggestion that you try to go beyond just the 2. Try not to do the bare minimum, just in case you don't cross the threshold for one of the documents where you think that you did an adequate job of discussing point of view, but perhaps in the eyes of the reader you didn't, and so you'll leave yourself short there. So again, you want to do this for at least 2, preferably 3 of the documents, discuss audience, point of view, and so forth. And again, this is going to be done for 2 of the 4 as the minimum. And then finally, you have to demonstrate a complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the question, using evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the question. So this is where the although or however or while formulation comes into play. So you want to discuss some alternate explanations, some alternate motivations than that what you focused on in your thesis. So let's say your thesis was discussing the economic motivation for a particular event. You might want to go on to say that there were other motivations, perhaps social, religious motivations that were also at play. So you want to show that you have some complex understanding. So as they say here, you want to explain the nuance that there are perhaps multiple variables. So if they ask you to analyze the political effect of something or the economic effect, you can touch on other areas. Additionally, another way that you can try to obtain this point is to talk about the continuity of a particular theme. So you may be discussing a particular theme in the context of, let's say, the Civil War or the Civil Rights Movement, but to show how that theme has appeared at other points throughout American history and to make the connection between the time period that you're discussing in the question and then other periods in American history that are also related to this particular topic. So to show some connections across time as well. So there are a lot of different ways that you could achieve this point. Again, I think the easiest way is to simply show how this has been an issue throughout American history and mention specific examples from history of where this came up. Or in addition, this should probably be done in combination, talk about different motivations other than those that you focused on in your thesis, right? So if you focused on the political motivations, mention the economic motivations. In other words, you want to show that there's complexity to a question. You don't want to simply just say everything was caused by X, but that X, while it was important, there were also influence from other factors, Y and Z as well. So you don't necessarily have to contradict your thesis, but just kind of enhance it by discussing the additional motivations that are at play. So I will share this rubric with everybody through the Google Classroom, but I just wanted to highlight a few things here. So again, there will be 10 potential points here. If you review the rubric, you'll see how each of the points is scored. Some of them, as mentioned, very similar to the way you could have scored them before. A thesis, a context paragraph. You're obviously going to use documents, you're going to describe them, you're going to connect them to your argument. So to that extent, this DBQ will be very similar to any DBQ that you've written before. It's just that the numbers are slightly adjusted given the modified format and only the 5 documents as opposed to the 7. So your goal should always be to use more to try to kind of over score so that if you don't achieve a particular threshold with one document, that you may do it with another, right? So they say use quote unquote 4, try to use all the documents, try to discuss all the documents and connect them to the topic at hand. If you try to do only the minimum, you run the risk, of course, of not achieving that particular point. So that's something to bear in mind. So again, I'll share this rubric with you. Have a look at it, and then if you have any questions, please share those with me, and I will get back and try to discuss them more specifically in another video. All right, hope everybody's doing well and staying healthy, and I'll speak to everybody soon.
Very organized, happened quickly, but we had Klobuchar and Buttigieg were the top here, and actually Bernie Sanders was not viable here. And now anecdotally, the crowd was a little bit older, but there were quite a few first-time voters here that I'll introduce you to. And I don't know if you remember, but